Well, welcome to the last book. This book is different. And as I made mention before, the last 3 or 4 books have been on the order rather than of instruction, have been more in summary, in conclusion, and pulling everything together. This time, we're going to talk about personal alchemy. And we're going to refer back to many of the concepts and ideas that have been presented throughout these books. But before we get that, I want to again reinforce something that these books really are all about. And those 4 concepts I've been talking about the last few volumes that we've covered, because I think it's so important. The focus of your studies and my studies really prioritize these ideas. And the first is to know. And that means that not only are we gaining information, we're learning to integrate and put into practice. And as has been mentioned before, and as all of you have understood, we have a recommended time frame of no earlier than a lunar cycle for completion of a book. And part of the reason for that is not that it couldn't go faster, because most certainly it could. It is that gives you time to reflect, to meditate, and to integrate. Because until we make these lessons a part of our life and living on a daily basis, we truly have not embraced the power that they have, and the power to change, and the power to understand. And that just falls into that second category there, leads straight into it. The idea of knowing what you want. What do you want to have come out of this information and understanding? I will admit, when I first started, other than getting through it, I didn't know really what I want, or it was very ill-defined. As I progressed through the information and as I have practiced subsequently, I have really come into an understanding of what it is truly that I want, and hopefully the methodology of how to get there. The second is to challenge yourself to take appropriate risks in your spiritual practice. The ability, the challenge to meditate, to take on, if you will, the challenge and the possibility of teaching, of working with others, of being a mentor, of fulfilling a role, is a risk. You're putting yourself out there. There may be times and situations where it doesn't work out as you thought it would. But and it's unfortunate, but it seems that through our pain is one of our best learning experiences. And as we put ourselves out there and take appropriate risks, we benefit and we grow. And the last is to share appropriately, and not just be broadcasting this information out to everyone. It's not that we're looking for exclusivity. We're looking for appropriateness. Not everyone is in a position where they can or will hear what you have to say. And actually, by sharing it with those that aren't ready, you may become discouraged because of the lack of reception. So listen, evaluate, and then as somebody says something, you can insert the idea of how these lessons and the Hermetic principles can be a guiding and directing force within their life, as it has been and is becoming within your life. There is also the perspective of Cicero that I mentioned in I believe, the last course. And that is that there are 2 ways to find satisfaction in life. First is a good library, the second a garden. A good library is one that is focused and provides you a resource to return to time and again, not just to look up the answers to a question, but for inspiration, for stimulation, for guidance. And I'm becoming more of an advocate of printed rather than electronic books, only because of the ease of access and availability. What would happen if we had a sustained period of brownout or a loss of electricity or something even more long-term? Not to have the knowledge readily at hand can be a limiting factor. So as much as possible, for your focus library, I would encourage you to have printed hard copy books. Also, connecting with nature. Our ancient brothers and sisters were keen observers of our environment. They watched the stars, they knew the cycles of life, they learned from nature that was around them. A garden's a good place to reconnect. I just planted tomato plants and put them in the greenhouse to germinate. And hopefully we'll have tomatoes over the winter along with lettuce and some other winter vegetables. And I do it not just for the food value, which is obviously very high, but as much or more to put my hand in the dirt and remember the place of origin and remember the connection that we have with all of creation that is around us. So that library and keeping yourself connected with nature are both extremely important. Now, this book, especially the first 5 chapters, are really more about reinforcing what we've already learned. I like the way that he put in what every neophyte should know on the way to becoming an adept. And there were essentially 3 things. And the first was I categorized within 5 areas. The first is that the books that we look at, not just this book, but all the others, are focused on practical application. Knowledge without application is really I'm not going to say of little use, but it is not of sustained use and does not reflect the power that it can. The second aspect is that, and this is a common misconception that I continue to hear, is astrology is not fortune telling. What is it? Astrology, again, is the understanding of forces at work. It is not a assured outcome. All it is a possible outcomes and influences that, if we're not careful to understand and in some way circumvent or reinforce, that those become a likely outcome, either in a positive or in a very negative sense. And one other way that is within this first realm is that astrology presents us with understanding our path of life. We all face challenges. What are those challenges? We all face opportunities. What are those opportunities? As we utilize astrology to our understanding and clarification, we can, if you will, promote the good and reduce what may be the evil or negative forces. One thing that I do, and I'm not saying you have to do this, I do every Monday, and I run my chart for Monday at 10 a.m. and look at the week, and I keep them. And I'll make notes on them. So I'm not sure that this can come through because of the blurred nature. It really doesn't. But then I also use the daily planetary guide that was talked about, which is a planner, and I write significant events that I see that are coming up or influences. Then I'll refer back to them the following week as I run the new chart and say, okay, what did I miss? What did I learn? What is the practice? And the point of it is whether you do it weekly, every 2 weeks, once a month, on whatever time scale that is important, that you are keeping track in your learning. You're also living that best life you can. And I believe, and these books reinforce that astrology provides you for that. Another aspect is that, and as above, so below. One of the Hermetic truisms is that the inner plane is a reflection of outer plane experiences and vice versa. That when we look at this world that we walk in, there is corresponding events, transactions, occurrences within the inner plane and vice versa. When there's a disturbance in one, there's a disturbance in the other. And understanding this, particularly in our interaction with other people or with other powers, it's very both assuring and encouraging that we have a sense of control. Now, that comes to that last point within the first of three things that we need to know, and that is that knowledge must be followed with action. That it is our responsibility not only to act in a constructive way for universal good, but it is selfish, I guess is the best word, to have information and not share it when and as appropriate. Not only sharing it, but utilize it, whether that be in teaching, whether that be in working in various tasks and activities, but taking that information we've been given and entrusted with is maybe the better word, and following those up in the action. So we have the power to direct our own destiny is one of the key precepts that he reminds us of. Understand how the inner and outer plane forces work. The birth chart, remember, is an individual's character, opportunities, harmonies, and discords that existed at birth. Now, then we can say, well, what's the purpose of the progress chart? Well, as we gain in age, the birth chart characteristics are still valid and still there, but the influences are beginning to shift. And because of, especially when you get into the 40s and 50s and beyond, you start to see that the influence of progressed may actually overcome and override a lot of the opportunities and limitations that we found in the birth chart. So understanding how that works and to utilize it is extremely important. Don't be caught up in the paralysis of analysis syndrome. Now, what do I mean by that? That is that you're trying to come up with exacting answers, specific information, and you keep looking and looking, and you don't move forward with what you do know. You may have 90% of an answer and spend the rest of your time in that last 10%, when 90% gave you enough to move forward. And yes, we want to be as complete as we can in terms of our understanding, but you make the decisions you can based upon the information you have. Obviously, if you have 90%, that would be stellar. I wish that most of my decisions were made with 90% of certainty of information. Oftentimes, it's a whole lot less. It also then encourages you to chart ahead and look for those major progressed aspects in the future. Again, use a calendar. Use a method of recording when those might be in the future, both those that have positive astrodynes and those that have negative. You're looking for those major progressed aspects that bring opportunity and bring possible turmoil, so that you can begin to prepare, so that you can make the best use of the time we have. So the ability to use our program to be able to use that sliding scale to move ahead and look for certain things is a little bit time consuming, but it's something to keep in mind and to take a good and a hard look at. Also, the second thing is that we should be cosmic minded. Now, there's a quote on page 12 in the Green Book in chapter 1, serial lesson 216. And I want to read the first two paragraphs. He talks about something called the religion of the stars, which is the ability to practice this belief system. Real devotion to the religion of the stars, such as the neophyte will find absolutely essential before he reaches adeptship, requires a complete readjustment of the mind and consequently of life from the conception and actions which are common to non-religious men. It requires an absolute and unconditional surrender of life to a religious principle. But this surrender and the actions which spring from it are far different from those of any Orthodox faith. The only resemblance to Orthodox devotion is the completeness with which the devotee delivers his or her life into the keeping of the divine mind. In the second paragraph, he or she is led to this surrender of his or her personal ambitions, not through blind faith, but because in some manner he or she has become conscious that the cosmos is an organization of minor intelligences of various degrees, presided over and permeated by an infinite intelligence. And that is a sentence that I've been meditating on the last couple of weeks, trying to really engage and fully incorporate that into asking that question before I take actions in my day-to-day life. One of the ways that also has helped is the Church of Life mantra. It is read every Sunday service. It's on the website. Print out a copy. Use that as a guide for living. It really encompasses how we can approach life. Also, look and search for the divine plan of our lives. One of the things that is reinforced in the book is that we all have at least one purpose. Understanding what that purpose is and what the other purposes are for our life helps us to live our best life. We also then need to understand the responsibility that is owed, note that word, owed to universal society. We have a responsibility. Once you gain this knowledge, you no longer have an excuse of saying, I didn't know, because you do know. And coming to book 21 is then documentation that you do know. And now it's time to carry out that responsibility. How do you do that? Most of the time, it's the focus on others and helping with regard to the freedom from want, the freedom from fear, the freedom from religion, and freedom from expression in our service to the universal good. We help carry out our responsibility when we incorporate and promote those freedoms. When we don't do that, there are consequences, and we end up with a world much as what we have today. This is maybe the reason that we have such an important role to play, and that these lessons are more timely now than they were when they were first written. The third thing to understand is the use of occult knowledge for personal use or to take advantage of another can have disastrous results. I had to buy it. I couldn't resist. I saw this. Here is a tarot system for winning the lottery. Now, that really is not an appropriate use of understanding how to use the tarot, because who's it benefit? Who's it really aiding? Well, it's purely self-fulfilling, self-motivation. And using occult knowledge for this type of use, or to take advantage of another person for manipulation, is really, really, really a harsh thing, and you must be on the guard of. And the reason is that it is so easy to utilize power. You know, the idea that power corrupts and ultimate power, or absolute power corrupts absolutely is really true. We can be tempted to use what we know and the power that we have ascertained and accomplished for selfish advantage, and we must guard against that. Chapter 2 3 habits that he talks about. And you'll find that the first habit, making all thoughts, feelings, and actions conform to universal moral code, is an aspiration. None of us are perfect. None of us have the ability to be perfect. But the more that we are an observer of our actions and activities with the thought of adherence to this principle, the better decisions we'll make, the higher the impact we will have. The second one I find really interesting, and that is, don't discount and accept praise and gratitude when you receive it. It's okay to do that. While there's always room for improvement, it's okay to give yourself credit when something positive's been done. Now, that's obviously a very delicate balancing act, but you want to not discount what has been done and or over-reward it. The third habit is becoming an invincible wall. And I think that's where it really comes in, that if you do take a task, take it to completion, at least to the best of your ability, with leaving nothing undone that could have been done. I certainly have, and I'm sure you can identify with things that you started but didn't finish. Sometimes for positive reasons, sometimes just for a lot of other reasons. If we have a mindset that we don't start out on a task unless we are committed to completion, we then will lead to improvement of the universal good. The last is a process of habit formation and use. Now, a lot of this is modern psychology, or psychology of the 20th century, that is still applicable today. Before you start making changes, you need to obviously examine the habits that we have today. We all operate from habits, being from driving to just actions and opportunities that we take that we don't even think about. But remember, new habits are best anchored when they replace an old one. And the more that we look to continually improve, the replacement of that old behavior with something that is positive is part of the formula for success. On page 39 of the Green Book, he talks about repetition and intention are the key to new habit creation. Depending on the type of activity, the repetition may be measured in days, weeks, months, or years before you obtain mastery, or it becomes more of what they will refer to as muscle knowledge, where it's just something that automatically happens. And depending on the type of thing we're talking about, the time frame for that, or the number of repetitions necessary, continues on. Chapter 3, Avenues to Illumination. I had an extensive conversation with someone this week about benefits and challenges of ESP. Remember, there are 3 types. There's intellectual ESP, which is highly recommended. There's emotional ESP, which can be problematic. And then there's mediumship, which is definitely problematic because you have lost control and given up control to another entity. Be aware of how you're operating. Oops, and what is appropriate. Did I lose my... That was strange. All right, is it viewed okay now? All right, the second is that there is a relationship between some mind and something on page 47 on the elements of truth. There are items of universal truth, but there are many more items that are situational truth. Read that element within page 47, because that could be a whole hour discussion in and of itself. Remember that we have the ability to tune in. Time and space are not limiters. When we talk about healing, when we talk about being able to explore the inner plane, the laws of physics that are in the outer plane do not apply to the inner plane, so that we have the ability to impact things that and places and situations that we cannot see, that may be even into the future. The need and use for meditation. I believe sometimes this was not emphasized as heavily in the previous books, but a time of slowing down and personal reflection and consideration is essential for us to gain perspective, and also for us to be able to incorporate those inspiring words and actions and deeds that we have in our life. A regular time of meditation in the morning or in the evening, or in a regular and consistent, I think is a key for being able to live a more illuminated life, but to move beyond and into a level of expertise that will continue to improve. Along with this, the use of affirmations and mantras, all of these are tools to be able to help us better step back, gain perspective, come to a higher degree of understanding, and, if you will, the ability to move to that next level. Spiritual hindrances, these are all pretty much logical. We know that there are some situations where, if you want to say it, that there will be those who are not encouraging for our learning and activity, mainly because whether you see it or not, you've begun to change. And that change is uncomfortable to all too many, even if it's a positive change. This change occurs not only in the outer plane of where we are right now, but also in the inner plane. And that, if you will, contrast between inner and outer plane can bring a level of discomfort to others at multiple levels. It's also really important to make sure that you do share appropriately. There was a quote that an argument never changed anyone's position, and I really believe that is true. Just because someone doesn't agree or may criticize does not mean that after stating your position that there's need to really go much further. We tolerate and we accept others, but we don't have to criticize them just because they have a different way of thinking than us. They may become very intolerant to you. They may become very combative even with you verbally and hopefully not physically. But it is not unusual that, and has been experienced in the past, that people who, like us, who practice a Hermetic approach with tarot, with the use of astrology, with the use of these other tools that we have, through their ignorance or misunderstanding or just their opposition, that they can make it a very uncomfortable position. There's also the intimate relationships that we're in, the very close relationships, how these can become more complicated when someone is not on a same or similar path. There can be opposition to study, to attending classes, opposition to extrasensory unfoldment. You may, if you share something that another person does not understand or misunderstands, that there may be just fear and reaction. Also, in terms of your spiritual development and overall domestic discord, guarding against these things, protecting the family, but yet staying true, is a balancing act. That is something that we all will continue to practice. And I can't say there's a better way and a less and then a wrong way to do it. It's more finding that balance within your life and your situation. Chapter 5, again, debate seldom convinces. It is, once you've stated your facts, it is just not profitable to be able to continue along those lines. However, I would strongly encourage a commitment to memory, or to make sure that you can answer the 50 questions that are listed on page 90 through 97. These are questions and answers we should know and understand. They cover the gamut of our belief system. The more conversant you can be in these, the better, and in many cases, the easier it is to avoid a confrontation or conflict. This also leads then to how we act, how we continue to improve our character. And these 5 points, I think, are essential and are fundamental. The first is think, and I might add act, in a kind manner. There are lots of people that I don't necessarily like. I don't, their politics, their beliefs, but that does not excuse me from not treating them with kindness. I do not have to agree, but that also does not give me license to be in conflict. Also, the more that I am eager to learn and open to learning, it broadens my experiences and acceptance of things that I don't know. He also refers to something called the habit system of energy. Again, this is one of those things that we could spend another hour or hours talking about. Refer to this serial lesson 220 and examine that. Utilizing our occupation. One of the things that is discussed both in earlier works as well as made mention of here is oftentimes how we got into our occupation was more happenstance than intention. One of the greatest gifts that we can give to those that we work with, or to our children, or to those that we have responsibility over, is by utilizing the tools of astrology and tarot and alchemy to help them find their best and highest use, their occupation. When we do that, and when we do that for ourselves and utilize our occupation and leverage it in a way that is a positive and helps benefit the universal good, we have lived a good life. And that the last item that he makes mention of is to focus on truth. There are so many things that I can say I disagree with, I don't like, situations that are problematic. Again, does not excuse me from focusing on what is true, what is good, what is beneficial, and what I know to be those things in the midst of all these other conflicts. Now, chapters 6 through 10 are a little bit problematic and something to read and to understand and have discussions with your medical professionals. But remember that we are not diagnosing or giving medical advice. In most states, that would be illegal. We understand that as I say, Mother was correct. We are what we eat. And the things that we take into our body can have and do have positive impact. Now, I utilize this information on these chapters 6 through 10 by going through and then actually speaking with my medical practitioner and having a series of blood tests run before taking supplements. I wanted to know, or special diets. I wanted to know what the medical levels were of these various things, the B complex, of D, because when you just take something without understanding the therapeutic range of what it needs to be, you may actually harm yourself more than help yourself. We normally think of the B vitamins as being water soluble, and you may have been told you can't really OD or take too much B vitamins, but that's not true. There's something called B12 toxicity I found out about, which I was taking an enormous amount of B12 for energy and others before I did the lab work, and it actually was causing a physical problem. My vitamin D has been extremely low. And if I had taken just what is recommended, it did no good. I have to take 4 times the recommended value to get my therapeutic blood level of vitamin D to where it should be. So using these chapters as kind of guidelines, going to your doctor saying, hey, I'm a little concerned. You don't have to tell them why or how. Just say, I'm a little concerned that maybe my D level's low, or maybe my magnesium's low, or is everything the way it should be, and ask them to run specific tests to verify and then to figure out the amount of those supplements, of those minerals, of those vitamins that you should be taking, and or diets. An all-protein diet may be helpful for some people, but not for others because of your medical situation. So just be careful in how you utilize this information for yourself, and particularly careful when you're talking to others, that we do not give medical advice. In summary, this is really a starting point, not the conclusion. You now have a rounded introduction, I'm going to say education, but more introduction to the Hermetic arts. By no means does this make you an expert. Does this make you an adept? This is the beginning of years of practice and of review. So now is the time to take charge of your life, again with the focus on universal good, and you may be shocked at the change that this can bring. Now, that leads to the question, if you've not already, and I'm sure most of us have at least started to think about, if not focused on, is what will be your focus? Where will you begin? And what is your challenge in the service to others? Is that going to be registration as a teacher? That could be. Will it be in terms of finding a voluntary outlet or working with others? I don't know. As you start to understand, based on these materials, where you go next, then real change will start to occur. And with that, that's really the conclusion of the books. That's all right. So, as I say, this is something that I encourage you to continue. I'm not going to say the word admonish, but I just caution you to beware. Focus on that universal good, and that will help. It's helped me tremendously, though sometimes I'm not always successful in terms of avoiding acting on my own behalf rather than acting on behalf of others. All right. With that, Vega, can you share the closing ceremony?